Okay. So the panel is on best practices and a whole lot of other topics that were meant to be discovered or talked about or discussed. Each of these topics could actually make up for a subject for at least a 2-day-long seminar. So, and I think we have, we're short on time. And we're going to start with best practices. And it's particularly contextual in the Indian scenario, what's happened with IPRS and with PPL. And I think it's important to understand, firstly, what the IFPI and CISAC perspectives were, or the past perspectives were of the copyright societies, and put that in context with best practices. So I'd like to start with Eric and ask Eric, how did the world look at IPRS, and what did you feel IPRS needed to do as CISAC in order to come up to a level which was internationally acceptable?
Thank you very much, Ameet. First, I want to repeat what I said in my introduction a few minutes ago, that CISAC maintains a series of rules to guarantee primarily to the rights holders, the authors, the composers, and the music publishers, that those $10 billion are managed as well as possible. It is complicated. This is a worldwide organization, agreements between 240 societies in countries that have different traditions, different economic development levels, and also different political systems. So it is a challenge, but we have those rules, and they are there to make sure that there is trust in the system, that if you are a right holder, you believe that we're doing our best to manage responsibly your royalties. Back to IPRS, and as you understood, I've been associated with this business for more than 20 years now. I joined CISAC as the chief executive in 1998, and I've been kind of following, together with KT, who was at the time the regional director for Asia Pacific. We've been following the struggles, the challenges that IPRS had to go through over the years. And my view is that it has been mostly the result of divisions in the Indian music industry. No fault of IPRS. There was no way that the requisite agreements could be put in place for one strategy, one path forward. And now that this unity has been reached, what IPRS needs to do is to finalize its new governance framework with new statutes, new rules that comply with international best practices. IPRS also needs to finalize the adoption of its renewed distribution rules that also will be in compliance with recommendations that CISAC has put forward over the years. And once this is done, I think that IPRS will be able to convince users of music here in India that they can trust IPRS to manage the rights of creators, of Indian creators of music, but also foreign creators of music, and the rights will flow. They will be distributed to the dozens of thousands of creators in India and millions around the world. So the process has begun. It's just the beginning, but as you know, a journey of 1,000 steps begin with the first one, and we are there at this point, and I'm, for the first time in 20 years, really and genuinely optimistic.
That's so good to know. KT, what sort of guidance has IFPI given PPL to take it through, a process where IFPI feels that it meets, in IFPI's view, governance standards, management standards in terms of compliance, etc.?
Well, as I mentioned earlier this morning, I think historically one of our challenges was a lack of visibility. It was not clear to us what is happening with PPL for a certain period of time. Now, with the changes that took place in the last 2 years, we now have a very good transparency, clarity, and in fact, we have just gone through quite a painful process with Rajat chasing me quite a few times on the constitutional changes. You know, so I think the constitution is very much like the structure of your house. If you create the structure correctly, it doesn't matter who comes and goes. You know, you will have a setup that will survive the human beings behind it. So we spent a lot of time on the constitution in the past couple of months. I understand that constitution will now be has been presented to the board and then will finally be approved. As far as that is concerned, representation is crucial. Membership itself is important. I think for a period of time, my understanding was there was no real push to increase your membership. You know, you need to have that membership coming in. Then you are representative. Once you're representative on the board, you need to also have that kind of representation. And you have to accommodate the different voices. Now, of course, then you have to take into account the strength of the respective companies in the marketplace, you know, as far as possible. So I think IFPI has worked with PPL in the last year or so on changes to the constitution. We have also asked to look at their mandates, you know, we have discussed about their licensing arrangements and so on. We have arranged for training, and we will continue to arrange for training because I think exposure to international practices is crucial. You know, so yeah, we have in place quite a number of measures that are still ongoing.
Eric, the World Intellectual Property Organization's mandates a best practices toolkit for CMOs. Are CISAC's professional rules on top of that? Are they complementary to each other? Is it something that CISAC recommends that CMOs follow in addition to the professional rules?
Indeed, it's extremely important to understand that, and I'm just going to state the obvious, we live in a connected and globalized world. And we all work for each other, we all represent each other. There's increasingly one music industry powered locally but able to transcend borders. So it's extremely important that all CMOs around the world have a common series of principles they follow. We know that one size fits all is not possible. It would be ridiculous to expect an emerging society like IPRS, for example, to fully work like my society that has been more stable in a different situation. But they should all aspire to the same transparency, good governance, and efficiency as much as possible. Many of the challenges today are created by technology and new business that came from technology. But solutions can come also from the same technology, the same IT processing power that has disrupted everybody. And this is a key element there as well. Societies not only need good governance, they don't only need transparency. This is crucial. This is a prerequisite. Without that, nothing can happen. But they also need to have access to data. They need to have access to information that enables them to correctly track the use of the music they represent and to distribute the amounts that are rightfully owed to the creators and publishers and record labels for the neighboring rights societies and artists. This is not easy. This is something that also is the focus of some rules that CISAC has about standard identifiers, making sure that each song, for example, has a kind of a license plate, like a car. Each car is identified uniquely by its license plate, and each song is identified by its ISWC. Each sound recording in IFPI is identified by an ISRC. All those things enable progress and enable the smooth management of copyright in India, hopefully soon, and around the world.
We've had, as a result, and this is something that has not been discussed very often, a lot of focus is on the copyright law and the changes. One of the consequences of what happened where IPRS and PPL were concerned was the promulgation of copyright rules and specific rules around copyright societies. which aim to regulate them and, in my view, aim to prevent a relapse of past events. Now, that intention was, I think, solid and spot on. But there is also then the element of overregulation in terms of where perhaps structures become unwieldy because of the copyright rules. So, KT, what's your advice to the government, to the DIPP, in terms of regulation where copyright societies are concerned? I don't think anybody would argue that copyright societies, the government should keep, some sort of a control construct or some sort of overview to ensure that there's compliance. But from a regulation perspective, what's your advice?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head. The first point really is there has to be a balance in the way regulations are implemented, are passed. You do not want to over-regulate. In fact, in a number of countries in the world, they have almost no regulations over collecting societies. So you're free to voluntarily associate, and you're free to break away and form another collecting society. In the case of India, I would advise against over-regulation. The key principles have to be put in place: transparency, accountability, good governance. That aside, there is a second issue. In the Indian Copyright Act, you do have a provision that says that there shall ordinarily only be one collecting society per category of rights. And I think that is a wise provision, and it should be exercised to ensure that, especially in a market like India right now, where we are trying to rejuvenate the entire collecting society market, that in each category of rights, the government should wisely choose one body to represent those right holders in the category. The other part, the final point to make is that in making that choice, aside from ensuring that the constitutional provisions are correct, the board representation, the membership representation is also crucial. You want to appoint a collecting society in place that represents the majority of right holders, because if not, you will create a problem for yourself. Users generally do not like to, to engage with more than one in each field. In fact, if they can, they just want to engage with one for all fields, right? Which, generally speaking, is not really possible. But I think that is the basic advice I would give now. The final point is this: I think we have to work quite quickly, because otherwise users take advantage of the uncertainty in the market. And that's also one reason why you see that the collecting society market here in India can't grow, because there is that uncertainty that is still continuing.
Eric, talking about users, I just came across a tweet that I was discussing with Javed Saab today morning by a Harvard Law professor called Rebecca Tushnet, who referred to, in context, to the Music Modernization Act and the move to plug a loophole which industry artists have wanted plugged for a long time. And she tweeted, and I'm going to quote the tweet, and this is a reference to Aretha Franklin. And she said, "And not for nothing, the legendary Aretha Franklin can't receive any more royalties no matter what. The grave is a fine and private place, but none, I think, do get there richer." It is in the context of copyright expansion, or the allegation that the Article 13 directive in Europe, the Music Modernization Act, the amendment in 2012, were instances, unwelcome instances of copyright expanding rather than correcting. And that seems to be not only an academic sort of worry or concern, but that's a concern expressed by a lot of the technology companies. What's the perspective of authors' societies and copyright owners in terms of why are these expansions required, or why are these corrections rather required?
A key point here as well. The there's a widely held view that copyright, neighboring rights can become a drag on growth and the expansion of cool companies, technology companies. And nothing could be further from the truth. Most of those companies rely on creative content to deploy their services, their offerings to the marketplace. I mean, my friend and CISAC president, that means super ambassador, not real president, but super ambassador, Jean-Michel Jarre, president of CISAC, often says that creators and creative industries bring the smart part to smartphones. Without them, there would be bricks or just phones. And this has to be well understood. It is an ecosystem. Like in an ecosystem, you have various life forms that create a sustainable environment, and that is creative industries with licensees, with users of music, including tech companies. Why would it be so difficult for the children and grandchildren of a creator like Aretha Franklin or others to be able to benefit from the genius, the hard work of their mother or father, grandfather, while they're alive? Why would that be different compared to the people who inherit the wealth of the founders of Google, of Steve Jobs, of Bill Gates, etc.? It's the same thing. It's economic value that's being created, and it's normal for that wealth to be available. And copyright industries, societies, record labels, publishers, they don't want to cripple tech companies. We want them to grow. We want them to be even bigger than they are today, provided they accept to share the value in a fair way. And that's why we advocate relentlessly for more efficient copyright protection or management, like the Music Modernization Act in the US, to fix a very complex mechanical rights licensing situation in the US. I cannot agree more with the fact that users want to deal with one organization usually. This is why we advocate for closing the value gap or the transfer of value problem to enable a balanced, a level playing field between rights holders and digital services, like especially user-uploaded content sites. This is key in Europe, in the US, in Canada, and in India as well. So this is an ecosystem. Our members, IFPI's members, create music and make music available, and others are able to grow entire industries out of that. They should pay their fair share.
And from a value perspective, KT, how is this value gap addressed? From practical terms, we've talked about the value gap and there's a need to reduce this gap, etc. But how do we practically address or close this value gap? Is it limitations to copyright ownership? What is it?
Yeah. The value gap, for those who may not be familiar with this, the value gap is largely created because of legislative provisions, existing legislative provisions. Now, about 20 years ago, the DMCA was introduced in the United States, and likewise in Europe, they have similar laws passed, and essentially it was to encourage the development of the tech companies. Now, the challenge is that the value has now shifted too far in favor of the tech companies. They are now worth billions, but the content owners, unfortunately, has been penalized in the process. So that's the value gap that we're talking about. Now, how did the safe harbor provisions create the value gap? What happens really is, for example, when your companies approach YouTube to license them for the use of recordings by their customers, YouTube basically said, as you heard, I'm not responsible for putting up this content, so I'm not liable. But to be safe, I offer you $100 million for your rights and take it or leave it. Because if you don't take it, what's going to happen is issue notice and takedowns. So in the past 20 years, we've been issuing notice and takedown. Just to give you an example, in 2016, IFPI and our member companies, as well as our national groups, issued in excess of 52 million takedown notices involving unique URLs and over 330 million delisting requests. That is over 50,000 notices a day, right? No impact, right? So if we are going to just rely on notice and takedown, obviously our industry is not going to survive. So we have had to enter into those deals with YouTube and companies like YouTube accepting a very low value because they claim protection under the safe harbor provisions. So for those of you, can I just ask a question? From our statistics, Spotify pays about $22 US dollars a year per user. Anyone want to hazard a guess how much YouTube pays a year per user? Yeah, $1. Actually, slightly less than $1. So that is the value gap we're talking about. We negotiate with Spotify, we negotiate with Apple, our companies do, and we get an average of about $22 a year per user. YouTube is paying about $1. And the main reason is YouTube is hiding behind the safe harbor provisions. So the solution is either a proper interpretation of the safe harbor provision to say that they are only available to a service that is technical, automatic, and passive, because that was the reason why the law and the way the law was crafted, and nobody else. Now, if you look at YouTube, it obviously is not technical, automatic, and passive, okay? So either the law has to be interpreted correctly, or legislation has to be amended to change the provision. And I think in Europe, we're working with CISAC to change that. And the US, we have been talking with politicians there as well as to look into the basis of the DMC.
Eric, I saw something which I personally thought was unprecedented when Mark Zuckerberg appeared before the US Congress or the committee of US Congress to discuss the Cambridge, the data breach, etc. In response to a question, and I think that sort of answer hasn't been given for the last 10, 15 years by a head of a technology company in response to a question as to whether technology platforms were liable for content on the platform. Mark Zuckerberg's answer was yes. Do you think that the concept and the principle underlying safe harbors, the European safe harbor, the DMCA principle, do you think this principle is now being revisited gradually, or is it something that was probably unrelated to what Zuckerberg said doesn't really signify that sort of understanding?
It will take some time, I'm afraid, but I believe that we are seeing a pattern, this narrative that technical platforms were mere conduits. They were doing nothing but just enabling others to say anything they wanted or to upload anything they wanted, and they knew nothing. This narrative is now being exposed for what it is, and to use a current term, I would say fake news. It was legitimate probably in the mid-90s when safe harbor provisions were conceived, to imagine that technology platforms would be like telecommunication businesses, like phone companies connecting people for private conversations, better private conversation for private conversations. Now we know it's untrue. So I think the cracks are appearing more and more. People start to realize that the same narrative that was used about music or audiovisual content on user-uploaded content sites is being used by other sites with way more sinister political consequences. So that has opened eyes. Yet there is still a lot of lobbying against these changes. The most interesting thing probably currently underway is in Europe. European Union has legislative power over copyright. It is a union thing that countries have to follow. And the European Commission has woken up, surprisingly, because they were not very helpful for the past 15, 20 years. But now they have woken up, and they realize that sites like YouTube, to name one, not the only one, are actually active managers of the content. And they want those sites to behave responsibly. If you have an editorial view of what is available on your platform, if you recommend things, you should be taking responsibility for it. And taking responsibility means doing what they sometimes do with hateful content, for example, but also doing the responsible thing on the economic dimension, to recognize that this content has value, that the music that people enjoy that is available on these sites is the main reason why YouTube is valued at dozens of billions of dollars. If there is an economic dimension, it should be shared with the people and companies that are at the origin of this wealth. It's as simple as that, yet many members of the European Parliament have been telling the European press that they haven't seen in years the kind of copyright of lobbying barrage than on Article 13 of a draft directive. They received millions of emails and tweets about this. And that is much of a concern. And it's important that artists, creators, people in the music business spread the word that you need to counter this barrage with our own barrage. Legislators need to hear from us. They need to hear from the millions of creators and people working in the music business that their livelihood is at stake. It is about creating a sustainable future for millions of individuals, millions of people around the world who depend on music and other creative arts to survive.
I think we are going to run out of time, so one last quick question. What advice would you give to the DIPP, where in context of this creeping trend of exceptions and limitations coming into copyright law, and very obviously and fairly, what underlies that is a concern about public interest and how public interest is to be balanced with the copyright interest. Now, what would you advise the DIPP from that perspective of how is it that industry can balance both without a continuing spread of these exceptions and limitations?
I think IFPI's basic position is that if there is any particular party pushing for fresh exceptions, there should be real proof and evidence to show that that exception is required. So for example, the recent push in Japan. In Japan, I think there was a very strong push, we believe also backed heavily by Google, for introduction of fair use into Japanese copyright law. Now, I think for those of us who are ex-colonies of the UK, we adopted the fair dealing exception. The fair dealing exceptions are very clear, very specific. Fair dealing for the purpose of teaching, fair dealing for the purpose of news reporting. If you don't fall within that categorization, you cannot have an exception. So what happened is that the tech companies are pushing heavily for fair use. So there's a concept that this is a fair use. So once it's a fair use, you are entitled to use it anyway, within that definition. What is fair use? The court will look at factors such as, quantity versus quality versus availability and so on. Great for people like Ameet, because it means litigation is going to shoot up the roof. For the user, I have no idea whether, of course, if I'm a user, this is fair use. The right owner is going to say, this is not fair use, right? So in the case of Japan, we helped our industry there to push back heavily, and the Japanese government concluded fair use is not something they want to introduce. They looked at the push by big data company. They need to do data mining, so they created a data mining exception. So you can see it's very specific. So we definitely recommend to the Indian government, when you want to introduce a fresh exception, be very specific, be very clear, because otherwise you're going to make Ameet richer than he currently is. Thank you.
May I share it? Yes. May I share a tale from Canada? In 2012, the last change in copyright law in Canada introduced a wide-ranging education exception, loosely defined, in a country that also follows the British tradition, fair dealing. This was promoted by universities to enable more photocopying of textbooks, etc. The result has decimated the textbook industry. Major textbook publishers have left the country because they cannot continue to be commercially successful. So be careful about unintended consequences. You could decimate, kind of eliminate from the map entire industries if you introduce broad copyright exceptions. Be careful about that. Try to have them only if they are necessary, if negotiation cannot deal with the problem, and make them as narrow as possible so that the courts can interpret them only as intended and not broaden it beyond reason.
Unfortunately, Eric, I must tell you in closing, our Indian courts are particularly fond of Canadian court doctrine that comes out in precedent and has followed them not only in terms of assessing originality or the test for originality, but also in the CCH case that came down for educational exceptions. That law has been adopted by Indian courts as well. So that kind of concerns us. Perhaps we should all also travel to Canada to make sure that the judges there don't change the law, because our judges are then going to change the law here. I want to thank Eric and KT for taking time out. I know this was a bit of a rush job, but at least I'm glad we didn't have to fight over the seats. Thank you for your patience and listening to our panel. Thank you.